All right, U.S. history students, today we're going to talk about the New Deal a little bit more. We're going to start 1936. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt is renominated by the Democrats. He's already won in 1932. He's implemented a lot of New Deal strategies, and he is renominated, and he's reelected to his second term in 1936. And he's going to continue New Deal policies to try to keep pulling the United States out of the Great Depression. So this leads us to what is FDR going to do now that he's reelected. He's going to continue New Deal policies. This is known as the Second New Deal, his second election. The economy had improved a little bit during his first term throughout the first part of the New Deal, but the gains were not as good as he wanted. And so unemployment was still high, production in the economy was still lagging, and so he's going to implement more things to try to get through the Great Depression. So what FDR does, he launches the second 100 days, the second New Deal, and he's going to focus on farmers during this part. He's going to reinvigorate the AAA, Agricultural Adjustment Act administration, which this helps to give aid for migrant farmers, to sharecroppers, and to poor farmers. So he's going to try to help farmers make money, get their crops growing again, get them land, get them farms, etc. So he's giving over $1 billion to tenant farmers to help them own their own land and start their own farms. Here's a picture of some tenant farmers. These are tenant farmers in Texas, Hardeman County, 1938. So they are tenant farmers without farms. These are the kind of people that FDR was going to try to help with the Second New Deal. The reinvigoration of the AAA was to give these guys their own farms, these tenant farmers. The next thing FDR is going to do is create the Works Progress Administration. Now, the goal of the WPA was to help those living in urban areas and cities to create jobs. So the WPA is trying to create as many jobs as possible, going to infuse government money to create jobs. And the WPA spent $11 billion creating jobs for some 8 million odd workers throughout the time period of 1935 to 1943. And so you may be asking, what kind of jobs is the government creating with these WPA jobs? What are they spending all these millions of dollars on? Well, the workers are building airports, they're building roads, streets, public buildings, they're paying people to be artists, to be writers, to be photographers, create art. Whatever we can think of, we're going to create a job. Whatever you're good at, we're going to create a job and let you do that and pay you for it. We're going to get this economy going. We're going to get people back to work. We're going to restore confidence in the economy and in the country. That was FDR's goals. FDR is also going to try to help workers. So he and Congress passed what's called the Fair Labor Standards Act. So sets a maximum on the hours worked at 44 hours per week and creates a minimum wage, 25 cents per hour. Here you can see a chart of minimum wage from 1938 through 2012. So 1938, when it started, you can see how it's gone up in worth. So this line is going to be what it's worth in 2012 dollars, and this is the actual amount going up. All right, next thing is the Social Security Act. This is a big one. We still have this today. It's one of the most important achievements of the New Deal because it is a lasting achievement, and it's still something that we still use today. It has three parts to it. So the government is going to provide old age pension. So you put in money for your entire working life to the government, and then when you retire, the government will pay you money so that you can live in retirement. The next thing is unemployment compensation. So if you are unemployed, the government will provide money while you're trying to find a job, so to help those who don't have jobs. And then third is aid to families with children and if you're disabled. So if you have children, you don't have a job, if you are disabled, you can't have a job, it provides a welfare for those people so that they can survive. This was the Social Security Act. We still have it today. Here's a chart you can look at if you want to go and see all the different things that Franklin D. Roosevelt helped to create during the New Deal, all of his programs. You can see all the different things that were created, all the different people. So it's just a huge amount of legislation, a huge amount of programs, ton of government spending. And all of this is to try to get the country back on track because we're in the depths of the Great Depression. People are in despair. They don't have jobs. They don't have money. They don't have a place to live. And so FDR is trying to fix all that through deficit spending, through government spending. And here's all the different New Deal legislation that he helped to enact. Throughout the presidency of FDR, the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, was a very influential person. She used her power as First Lady to help women gain higher political positions, so we see women rising to higher political ranks. She was very influential. She advised her husband, the president, a lot. And because of her work, Frances Perkins became America's first cabinet member. So first person to sit on the cabinet, advise the president, head a major part of the government. So she was the cabinet member over labor. African Americans also made gains during the New Deal era, during the presidency of FDR, through Eleanor Roosevelt and her help, and through the work of a guy named A. Philip Randolph. So he was the head of the first all-black union, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, and he organized what was going to be a big march and protest in Washington if FDR did not move in and help African Americans gain some rights as far as labor and jobs were concerned. And so due to the threat of that march and that activism by A. Philip Randolph, FDR signed legislation that created some equality in the workplace that the government was going to try to enforce to help African Americans. Other gains by African Americans during FDR's time were there was over 100 African Americans that were appointed to different positions within the government, one of those being Mary McLeod Bethune, who headed up the Division of Negro Affairs for the National Youth Administration. Now, the National Youth Administration was something created under the New Deal to help youth, and she was the head of the Negro Affairs portion. Now, even though African Americans did gain a lot under the FDR administration, he never fully committed to civil rights. And so greater gains could have been made, but were not made. Native Americans are also making gains during this time period. So during the 20s and 30s, Native Americans are making gains. We talked about earlier the American Indian Citizenship Act of 1924 under Coolidge, which granted African American citizenship. And then 1934, the Reorganization Act was passed. This was under FDR. It gave natives more ownership over their reservations. And so it continues this policy of moving away from assimilation, which was the Dawes Act, so making Native Americans assimilate, and more towards giving them autonomy, giving them citizenship, letting them keep their culture and kind of live as they want to live. So going back to the 1936 election real briefly, FDR did win, and he had, just to show you the amount of appeal that he had, especially urban areas among African Americans, Jews, Catholics, immigrants, they all supported FDR. And this map from the 1936 election shows that. So you can see the wide support that he had, won most of the country except for Maine and Vermont, up here in the Northeast, but had widespread popularity throughout the country. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, radio is gaining immense popularity. Sales of radio are increasing dramatically. And by 1940, you have almost 90% of Americans owning a radio in their home. And because of this widespread number of radios in Americans' homes, FDR used this to communicate with Americans. So he had what he would call fireside chats. Now, these are very important because it was him sitting down and speaking directly to the American people, right into their homes, right into their living rooms, like he's sitting right there. He's keeping them updated on the government's efforts during the Great Depression, trying to reassure them, letting them know everything that he's trying to do. And so it really helps Americans have a connection with FDR and is able for them to stay updated with everything the president is trying to do. And so he uses these fireside chats to his advantage and to help Americans know what's going on. Before we finish up, I just want to hit a few of the artists that emerged from the New Deal era, from the Great Depression era. You have painters like Edward Hopper and Iowa's Grant Wood. They were famous because of their work in the WPA program. Remember, the WPA is paying artists, is paying people to get back to work. So some of the most famous works that you see around today from this era were created by the WPA and those that are being paid to make artwork. You also have photography. Dorothea Lange, she gained fame because of her photos of the Great Depression era. And so you have artists coming to fame due to their work in the WPA. So before we finish up, we're going to talk a little bit about the impact of the New Deal and opinions about the New Deal. Some people have loved it, some people have hated it. It's created praise, it's created criticism, and mostly it falls along partisan lines. That means that people that agree with FDR were mainly the Democrats who were behind him, and those that opposed him were mainly the Republicans and conservatives who opposed government involvement in the country's affairs. And so it kind of falls along that line. It still falls along that line today. Those who love and hate the New Deal, those who think the New Deal should or should not have occurred, still fall upon those lines of conservatives, Republicans, liberal, Democrats. And three last things I don't want you to forget. The FDIC, we still have it today, insured banking. So that's what FDR did to make sure that the banks were stayed sound and people kept their money in the banks. Deficit spending. After FDR used deficit spending to try to get America back on track throughout the Great Depression, we still use this today. It's a lasting legacy. Governments still go into debt to pay for different programs that they want to create. And lastly, Social Security. We still have it to this day. It was created during the New Deal programs, the Great Depression era, and it kind of led to this lasting legacy of the government being more involved in citizens' lives and the government taking a greater responsibility for the social welfare of its citizens.